Hi, everybody. Good evening. Where are you at 10 o'clock Eastern on this Thursday evening? I'm actually in Palm Beach, Florida. I've taken quite a tour of Florida this week. I was in Orlando at the American Camps Association. If you missed that Facebook Live, that was just yesterday. Oh, you ever have one of those days where you can't believe something was just yesterday? And what we talked about then was how old is too old for timeouts? What are timeouts good for and what aren't they good for? What do they teach our kids? When do we have to quit them? And so I hope you'll check that out in my Facebook stream. And tonight we're going to talk about something different entirely. And that's how do we get our kids to engage? How do we get them to talk to us, to tell us the real stuff that's going on with them, to answer our questions with more than just one word? In the meantime, will you tell me how you're doing and how old the kids are in your house, where you're from, and what you're thinking about in terms of kids? I want to share with you the question that we're asking, if I can figure out how to. Yes, I'm learning my technology. How do we get kids to talk to us? This is such a good question. One of my kids, when he was really little, he used to just talk and talk so much that when we were staying with our cousins and his cousin who was just a year older, so he was 3 and she was 4, and they have a split level home and we were visiting, and she and I were in there on their main level in their play area, and she said to me, "Debbie, where's Ari?" And I said, "Hang on." And I listened for a minute and I didn't hear him talking, and I said, "Oh, he's asleep." And she said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Because he's not talking." This kid talked from the time he woke up in the morning until the time he went to bed at night. And I thought it was really unusual until my mom came to visit. And when her husband, who hadn't known me as a kid, said, "Wow, Ari really talks a lot," my mom looked at me very patiently and said, "No, not that much really. Not as much as his mother." And I thought, oh, I better get her nicer Mother's Day cards. So we often have kids when they're little who talk and talk and talk and talk. And I know where my kids get it. But then it happens often around middle school, and there's more of a pressure on boys about this than girls, generally speaking, to keep more to themselves. Some kids are more naturally private people. That's not an entirely bad thing. And I don't mean because they're not talking our ear off. I mean, it's not an entirely bad thing because when our kids learn a little bit about being quiet, it means that maybe they're not sharing absolutely everything with absolutely everyone, which can be a problem also. So it's not always a bad thing that our kids learn a little bit of privacy and discretion in middle school, but it can be awfully frustrating for us when we know as parents that it's so super important for our kids to talk to us about their experiences and their feelings and their questions. So again, feel free to tell me in the comments how old your kids are and how old the kids that you're thinking about are. And if you have somebody who is a chatterbox or somebody who's a little bit more private. I think that there are a couple of ways that we really get our kids to open up. And I want to talk about tips that work especially well in middle and high schoolers, but you can start using these when your kids are really little to establish a pattern. So I want to talk in general about 3 tips. And one tip that I want to talk about is, oh, Jen says she's thinking about her 9-year-old. And Jen, do you have that experience that your 9-year-old doesn't really want to tell you what's going on, or you ask how that person's day was? You have a chatterbox. Great. So keep that habit. How do you keep that habit when a kid is going to developmentally maybe just get a little bit quieter in middle school or high school? One thing is by using your skills, practicing asking questions that can't be answered in one question, asking for stories, asking good questions like you might have learned to ask when you were in elementary or middle school and you were supposed to write an article about something, asking who and how and what questions. Those are harder to answer with one word or with grunts. But another thing you can do, and this is something that I talk about in one of the videos that I have, is playing a game called High, Low, High. So instead of asking your child, how was your day? When it's pretty easy to say fine or boring or whatever, is to say, tell me something great that happened today, something kind of lousy that happened today, and something great that happened today. Because then you're encouraging stories. And the more we get our kids in the habit of telling us stories, the more positive they can usually be, that's what we want from them as they get older. They may not always give it to us, but we get them in the habit. So one tip is to have that be your usual conversation, is that you ask really open-ended questions or weird questions like, I've just been thinking about jobs. What job would you never want to have? When you ask a question in that way, you'll sometimes surprise a kid into being like, oh, or if you were a candy bar, what candy bar would you be and why? And our younger kids, when they're in that chatterbox phase and that age where they really have lots of things that they're thinking about, they often really love those off the beaten path, off the usual question, not just asking the same question every night. The second tip that I wanted to talk about is the possibility that you will put in time asking your kids to tell you about things that are just important to them, that aren't you. Kim says some kids have learned to refer to high, low, high. And you can use that same game as rose and thorn. I think that's true. I've also heard it called rose, thorn, and bloom. And that third part is something you're looking forward to that's coming up. Kim, have you heard it? Have you heard people talk about it in that way? When we want a kiddo to talk to us, though, that isn't, because we're worried or because we really need to hear more. Mike says that he does roses, thorns, and gratitudes every night. And gratitudes is another good way to get kids to open up with longer conversations. It's really hard to answer that in a one word. They can do it, I think, if they're really determined. But to answer in just a one word answer or a short phrase. When we want our teenagers or our middle schoolers to talk to us about hard stuff, I think that it is really useful to first talk to them about the stuff they just want to talk about. Ask them who they're watching on YouTube, not to get them in trouble and not to double check on content. We do those things, but to just say, hey, tell me something that made you laugh today. Or what's the most interesting thing happen in your friend group? Not to catch them, not to get anyone in trouble, just to put in the time having conversations with them so that they're in the habit of having regular conversations with us that don't have a hidden agenda. And that actually brings me to the third tip for getting kids to really open up, which is being really transparent. If you need your child to use more words and tell you more about the test they didn't do very well on, or the bad mood that they came home in, or why they don't hang out with that one friend anymore because you're concerned, own it. I'm worried about you. It's my job to know how you're doing and to make sure that if you need support, you're getting it. And I think you might need support about this friendship right now. And to be persistent in a way that shows respect for your kids. So if they say, well, I don't, everything's fine, to say, okay, I'm not sure I believe that, but I'm going to leave it there for now. And I'm going to ask you about this again tomorrow. I have a podcast that's coming up. We're going to launch here in the next few months. And just as a little teaser, in one of the opening episodes, I talked to kids, and I'm going to talk to kids in every episode. I talk to teenagers about how involved should their parents be in their friendships and in their drama. And one of the things that the girls I spoke to told me is that you should not give up if you're worried about your kid. You shouldn't stop asking. You can stop asking them right then. Sometimes that's the right thing to do. If they tell you they need a little bit of space, or if they say they don't want to talk about it, believe them. But the girls really recommended keep coming back, keep asking, and say, I'm going to keep asking, not because I'm trying to frustrate you, but because helping you do better or be okay, that's a big part of my job. So those three ideas, that we give our kids lots of practice at telling us stories, that we engage with kids about stuff they just feel like talking about, that doesn't have any sort of agenda, and that we're transparent about the reasons that we're trying to get them to use more words. Those three things can really help us to reach kids. Not every time and not all the time. And that reminds me, do you guys ever, when you're trying to get your kids to open up about something and it's not working, do you have any tricks or any hacks that you use? Do you have another adult in their life that you'll ask if they'll check in with them? Or do you ever have a book series that you read with a younger child, or a TV show, or some sort of social media hack for saying, hey, if you can't talk to me about this, can you talk to me about something similar that's happening on Riverdale? or some other teen TV show that you know that your child is watching, that I hope you're also watching, either with them or on their own, so that you know what's going on. Those are things I've seen really work. Knowing who the adults or the near peer mentors are in your kid's life, meaning, is there a babysitter that you have that they really connect to? Is there somebody older than them on a team they're on, or a youth group that you trust and that they trust? Sometimes that's an easier person for your kid to talk to. And it's, of course, always feels best when our child's talking to us. But if they, for whatever reason, feel like they can't open up to us right now, if there's another adult or another young adult or older teen that you really trust and they really trust, talking to someone is better than talking to no one. We can often really earn our kids' respect by saying, I see that you can't talk to me about this right now. Who could you talk to that you know is reliable? So those are just some ideas for talking to our kids in ways that will help them talk to us. This can be a really long process, and it can feel a little bit upsetting or even hurtful that a child who was a chatterbox or seems like they'll talk to someone else doesn't want to talk to us. And that can feel like rejection. And it's really easy to take that personally. But if you can remember back to when you were 11 or 13 or 15, you were usually thinking about yourself. You weren't usually thinking about the other people that wanted you to talk to them. It wasn't a comment on that grown-up. You were just wrapped up in what was going on in your own mind, and chances are your kids are too. I want to mention a couple of things before we wrap for this Facebook Live, and one of those is I love getting your questions, and I so appreciate it. And there is always an opportunity for you to share with me the questions that you have, and you can get on my website at any time. Oh, look at that, I made the technology work. That's a great way to contact me with questions. And if we might use it for a Facebook Live, we'll reach back out to you and let you know. As you can see, we can do these completely anonymously, but sometimes people like to join in and say, oh yeah, this was my question. Here's a little bit more background about it. And that's also a really interesting conversation. And I'm going to be offering a webinar. And we're going to put the link in the comments sometime in the next probably about 10 hours to sign up for that free webinar, which shows how to use my change of behavior in a week system to get rid of a behavior that most of us really can't stand, which is whining. I wish that I could say that whining was only a problem for the toddler or preschool set, but if you have lived with a tween or a young teen, you know that often whining comes back into vogue. So there are some pretty straightforward techniques that I'm going to show you how to use in an 18-minute webinar that will help you get rid of whining in your home and make it a more peaceful place. Thanks everybody for your time, and I really appreciate the comments and all the likes and the love, and I will see you next week.